Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Jimmy, and welcome back to That's What I Call Soccer. On today's episode, we've got a Game Week 2 preview. We'll catch up on if any teams are on doubles or buys this game weeks and what the injury updates look like. Then we'll take a look at the top owned players from each position going to the weekend. And lastly, we'll take a look at how my team's lined up and what my strategy is going into the week. So I put all the fixtures for the weekend below. So every game this weekend will be played on Saturday, starting with LAFC hosting Portland at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be a great game to use on the front end of your switcheroos, your keeperoos, and your auto-roos. Just a disclaimer, if you hear what sounds like an old man snoring next to me, it's just my cat. His name's Swisher, and he's got an upper respiratory problem that can't really be fixed, and so he's just kind of loud. Say hi, Swisher. If you're enjoying this type of content, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell below, as I will be releasing multiple videos per week on MLS Fantasy related content. And I thank everyone so much for tuning in and watching so far. And Game Week 2 will wrap up on Saturday night, 10:30 p.m. kickoffs, in San Jose hosting Vancouver Whitecaps and Seattle Sounders hosting Real Salt Lake. So looking at a few matchups from Game Week 2 to potentially target. Starting off, I've got LAFC versus Portland. LAFC is the reigning Supporters Shield and MLS Cup winners. And while I do think they have a slightly weaker team than they did last season, I still think they're a really strong team that's going to score lots of goals. And I don't think Portland looked particularly strong the other night against SKC. My next matchup that I think a lot of people are looking to target is Columbus hosting DC. DC did come out of Game Week 1 with a last-minute win against Toronto, and Columbus lost 4-1 on the road to Philadelphia. But if I'm targeting anyone from this matchup, it's probably on the Columbus end. Even though the scoreline looked pretty bad against Philadelphia, I thought Columbus started the game really, really well. A young team with a new coach, the first game of the season on the road at one of the hardest places to play at Subaru Park, in a stadium that Philadelphia hasn't lost in over an entire year. It was always going to be a tall task for Columbus. But we know the quality that Cucho and Zelarayan have in this Columbus side. My next matchup to look at is Austin hosting Montreal. Now we know what happened to Austin last week in their matchup against St. Louis when Julian Cascante went down with a long-term injury and Kip Keller came in his replacement and had an absolute stinker. But I'm calling for Austin to have a big bounce-back game here. A lot of people have doubted Austin, and they continue to doubt Austin even after they did so well last season. So they're really going to want to come back strong in this game. And against an entirely new Montreal team on the road, I think that Austin might have some goals in them, even if defensively they'll probably look a little shaky going forward. That being said, I'm having deja vu to what I said last week when they were playing St. Louis in St. Louis's first ever MLS game. And St. Louis came out with a win. So I don't know, maybe this isn't exactly the best game to target from a fantasy perspective, but it's one that I'm really keeping my eye on because I think there's going to be goals in. And my last matchup to target is one of the late ones with Seattle Sounders hosting RSL. Now, RSL did get a win on the road in Vancouver last week to kick off their campaign, but I thought Seattle Sounders looked extremely good at home. They were playing a Colorado team in which had an abysmal road record in 2022, and Seattle's goals were a little bit more of the hard-nosed, grinded-out goals, but they all count at the end of the day, and they did keep a clean sheet. So I like the looks of a few picks from Seattle this week. So just looking at what teams are on doubles and buys this game week, we've got no teams on a double and just Minnesota on a bye week. So if you're looking for cheap $4.0 million options as scrubs to use in your autoroos and switcheroos, you'll want to use Minnesota players this week. Now getting on to some key injuries to note. First, we've got Austin's defender Julian Cascante, who did go down with a shoulder injury in week 1 and is going to be looking to miss about 6 to 8 weeks. Next, we've got LAFC goalkeeper Martin Crépeau. It does seem like Crépeau's injury is starting to trend in the right direction, but he's definitely not ready for Game Week 2, so if you're looking for an LAFC keeper to run in your keeperoo, definitely don't want to use Crépeau. Now, Chicharito was listed as questionable at times last week, and to the days leading up to the match, which was eventually canceled, he was listed as out, and no one was really too entirely sure what his injury status was, but in a bizarre turn of events, Chicharito took it upon himself to update his fans on Twitch and let people know he'll be out for 2 to 5 weeks. Needless to say, Greg Vanney and LA Galaxy weren't too excited about that, but Chicharito does what he does. Toronto's Lorenzo Insigne, I think, is listed as questionable right now. It doesn't seem like he's going to be ready for this weekend, although his injury doesn't look to be long-term. Colorado's forward Diego Rubio's out for 2 to 5 weeks with a knee injury. Taxi Funtos is listed as out for DC United. Now, while Vargas is still listed as out for Seattle, Raul Ruidiaz is back in training, and it does look like he'll be available for selection this weekend. I'm not entirely sure if he's going to start yet, but it does look like Ruidiaz is back on his way. Leo Campano looks like he's going to miss some time for Inter Miami, which is going to open the door for Joseph Martinez in the forward position. It finally looks like Atlanta's new forward, Giacomakis, has got his visa approved, and he's on his way, and looks like he will be available for selection tomorrow. Again, I'm not entirely sure if he's someone that's going to start right away. I don't know if he's someone that was training with the team and just wasn't allowed to actually play in competitions yet, so just make sure you're watching the lineups if he's someone you're high on. And my last injury to note is Montreal's goalkeeper Pentemis has gone down with his shoulder injury that's going to see him missing 2 to 6 weeks. That should open the opportunity for young goalkeeper Jonathan Sirois to step in his replacement. So looking at the top own goalkeepers going into game week 2, at number 5, we've got Seattle Sounders' Stephen Fry. Him and Seattle did keep a clean sheet in game week 1, and they are back at home against RSL. And at $6.3 million, I completely understand why just about 6% of managers have him this week. At number 4, we've got a man I just talked about, young goalkeeper from Montreal, Jonathan Sirois. Now, Montreal will be on the road at Austin, who's looking to have a bounce-back game after their blunder against St. Louis City. But I think a lot of people see value in a 4.0 starting goalkeeper and being able to use the money elsewhere and throwing him as part of a keeper room. Number 3, we've got New England's Jordy Petrovic, who's going to be hosting Houston this week. I thought Houston looked pretty good in game week 1 on the road to Cincinnati, but we know what Petrovic can do, and he was back to his best in game week 1 with keeping a clean sheet and having 4 saves on top of that for a total of 9 points. Even though Austin ended up conceding 3 goals and losing the game to St. Louis, Brad Stuvers still had 6 saves for a total of 5 points, which is a huge reason almost 15% of managers have him in right now. And number 1, Philadelphia's Andre Blake, another one that I thought had a really unfortunate week in game week 1. He only had 2 saves in game week 1, which is why he didn't have many bonus points, but that's because he didn't really have much to do outside of the own goal that they conceded. We know how good Philadelphia is, and even being on the road at Inter Miami and having some risk of rotation with CONCACAF Champions League coming up next week, I think Andre Blake's one of the people that's going to be nailed on. And having a little bit of a price reduction last week and being $6.8 million, a little bit of an easier pill to swallow and for people to fit him in this week. Just looking at some value goalkeepers here, as we've already talked about, Jonathan Sirois from Montreal is going to be the starting goalkeeper and is only $4.0 million. We've also got Chicago playing their first game of the 2023 coming off a bye in game week 1, in which we'll get to see their $4.5 million goalkeeper Richie have his first start. I'd suspect $5.3 million goalkeeper Tyler Miller to be back between the posts for DC this weekend on the road at Columbus. And at $5.5 million, San Jose goalkeeper Daniel is a pretty decent pick, in which they'll be hosting Vancouver Whitecaps. And lastly, he's a little bit more expensive at 6.0, but Charlotte goalkeeper Paul Cisneglia looks to keep getting the starts. Now, they are on the road to St. Louis this weekend, which is going to be playing their first home match in front of a sold-out crowd in their brand new stadium. So I'm not entirely sure that Cisneglia is a good pick this week, especially because Charlotte wasn't great on the road last year. And to be honest, I'm not sure if any of these are great picks, to be fair. But if you're looking for a few cheap options that are going to start, here they are. Moving on to the top-owned defenders, at number 5, we've got Charlotte's Bill Tululoma. Now, we just talked about Charlotte being on the road to St. Louis. I expect St. Louis to be up to the task, but at the same time, I wonder if St. Louis is going to be a little too hungover from their win in Austin last week and too hyped up for their first game in front of their fans. Nonetheless, Tululoma is someone that's going to get you a few bonus points, and it does look like he actually is going to be taking some free kicks as well. Now, at number 4, we've got Atlanta United's Brooks Lennon at $6.7 million, who will be hosting Toronto, which I think is a pretty decent clean sheet opportunity. And on top of that, Brooks Lennon could be a slightly cheaper Kai Wagner option if you're looking for a defender that has some potential offensive upside. Number 3, we've got FC Cincinnati's Matt Miazga at almost 22% owned by the managers this week. Now, I don't necessarily understand this pick as they are on the road to Orlando, which has a pretty good offense, I think. They only scored 1 goal in game week 1 off a penalty, but I think they'll get it going. They have a lot of pieces I think are going to make them one of the best attacks in MLS this year. And I don't think that Cincinnati particularly has the best defense. But if you're looking for someone to collect some bonus points, maybe Matt Miazga is your guy. Number 2, we got $7.0 million Nashville defender Walker Zimmerman, who not only kept a clean sheet but had a goal in his opening match against NYCFC for a total of 14 points. They are on the road to Red Bull this week, which I think is a slightly different opponent than being home to New York City FC. But I think Nashville has a pretty solid defense, and while I don't expect the goals to keep coming for Walker Zimmerman, I do think there's a decent bonus point potential and maybe an opportunity for a clean sheet this week. And at number 1, we got $7.5 million Kai Wagner. Now, there is a little bit of rotation risk with Philadelphia this week, considering they are playing in CONCACAF Champions League against Alianza on Tuesday. But the interesting thing about that rotation is that you might end up seeing Philadelphia implement a back 3 or a back 5. And if by chance Kai Wagner does start and is in one of those wing-back positions where he's going to get really high up the pitch, then I really like Kai Wagner for his offensive upside even more. I saw a stat earlier that said he had the highest cross efficiency in game week 1. I'm not sure if that's amongst defenders or amongst all players, but either way, it's quite impressive. And while I'm not extremely high on Philadelphia keeping a clean sheet against Miami on the road, I do think there is some good potential upside with Kai Wagner offensively if he is in fact in the lineup. Looking at value defenders, we'll start with the 16-year-old from DC, Akambone, who's only $4.3 million. And while they are on the road to Columbus this week, if you're looking for a cheap defender that is going to get some starts, I think Akambone is your guy. Next, we have someone who had a really tough game in match week 1 with Kip Keller from Austin FC. Now, in Kip Keller's defense, he was thrown into a really tough situation with Julian Cascante going down with injury early in the game. And coming into the game, his center back partner and someone that's playing in their first MLS match, a really tough situation to be in, and it just kept going from bad to worse for Kip Keller. So I'm looking for him to have a really big bounce back week. I'm not entirely sure in my confidence in Austin keeping a clean sheet against Montreal, but I think there's some bonus points to be had from a defense that lacks a little bit of experience and continuity with some moving pieces in and out. So yeah, I think at $4.9 million, he might be a good pick out. Portland's Rasmussen, he is only $5.0 million, but he is playing away to LAFC this week, who is the reigning MLS Cup champions and Supporter Shield winners, and we know what they can do in the attack. That being said, I'm not entirely sure if Portland keeping a clean sheet on Monday was a result of Portland having a good defense or more a result of SKC having a bad offense. But at $5.0 million, he might be a good defender to throw in, especially against the heavy attack. There might be some bonus points to be had. And lastly, we've got Marie from San Jose. Now, he did get a clean sheet in game week 1, but that is because he came out at the 61st minute mark. You've got to stay into the 60th minute in order to be eligible for the clean sheet, and he just missed that, which means there might be a little bit of rotation risk for Murray, but at $5.5 million and being home against Vancouver, I think it's a pretty decent pick. Moving on to our top-owned midfielder, starting at number 5, we've got Atlanta United's Thiago Almada. He did have 2 late goals in their season opener against San Jose for a total of 13 points, which was good enough to see him at almost 16% ownership this week. Number 4, we've got FC Cincinnati's Lucho Acosta. Now, Lucho was someone that I had in my lineup a lot, that I actually ended up captaining in game week 1, but he really let his owners down, not having any goals, not having any assists, and only having 3 points overall. Being on the road to Orlando, I don't think his matchup gets any easier, but we know what Acosta can do. He did miss a pretty big chance in game week 1 and wasn't on the ball and moving it as much as we know him to be, but I think he's still a pretty decent pick, and his price has dropped a little bit to 8.8. So it could be someone you're able to slot into your lineup this week. Number 3, we've got Hani Mukhtar, who didn't start in game week 1, but he did come off the bench for about 15 minutes and made an impact right away with an assist to Schaffelberg. It was good enough to see Hani Mukhtar get 5 points in his 15-minute cameo, and he's still owned by about 24% of managers going into game week 2. His price has dropped by just 0.1, which isn't a lot, but if you're strapped for cash, it might be something you can conceivably work in. He's the reigning MVP, the reigning He's the reigning MVP, the reigning Golden Boot winner, and he's going to be at the center of Nashville's attack. Number 2, we've got $9.5 million midfielder from Philadelphia, Daniel Gazdag. Now, he did end up having the most points in game week 1 with 2 goals and 2 assists. He didn't have many bonus points on top of that, but 20 points in game week 1 is a really good week. And being on the road to Miami, I think he's got another goal in him. And number 1 at the midfielders, almost 42% owned going into the weekend, $9.3 million, Sebastian Driussi. He did have a goal in his opening game against St. Louis, and they are going to be going up against a team that's not exactly put together in Montreal. So I think a goal from Driussi is a really good possibility this week. I've got one in my team right now, and there was another one that I was highly considering. But first, let's talk about New England's Noel Buck. Noel Buck is only $4.3 million, and he had a pretty good game in match week 1. In addition to that, you've got a slightly cheaper option at 4.2 with Rivera. So if you're looking for a really cheap midfielder to throw in your team and see some price rise, this might be some really good options, both being at home against Houston. Next, we got $5 million St. Louis City midfielder Jared Stroud. He did score a goal in game week 1 against Austin, and while the way he scored it was a tiny bit controversial, he made the best of his opportunity, and that's all you can ask for, especially from a $4.5 million midfielder at the time. He did see a price rise of $500,000. So if you had him, you got 11 points and a little bit of a price rise. Happy days. And being at the $5 million price point and playing their first ever game at home in their brand new stadium in front of a sold out crowd, I think Jared Stroud might be a pretty decent option if you're looking for a cheap midfielder to throw in your team this week. Now, I don't think he's the most attacking player, and they will be on the road against LAFC this week, but at only $5.1 million, he will be a pretty decent differential pick if he does have some points, and yeah, he might be someone to throw in your team if you're looking for someone early in the week to throw on your bench. At $5.5 million, we've got an option from Charlotte and Bronico. Now, they will be going on the road to St. Louis, which I just talked about could be a really good game for St. Louis. But again, at $5.5 million, he is another option to have in your team on the bench. And to wrap up the value midfielder, someone we talked about last week and someone I had in my team, Ojeda from Orlando City. He didn't get off the mark in game week 1, but I think points are coming from this guy, and I don't think he'll be below $7 million for much more this season. So I wouldn't argue at all if people just kept him in their team for week 2. And wrapping up the most owned players with the forwards, at number 5, we've got Columbus's Cucho Hernandez. Now, he didn't have a good game in game week 1. He didn't really have any chances. And in fact, really the only thing he had on goal was a little dribbler that he put in front of the net that ended up being an own goal, which is the only goal Columbus scored. But I still think Cucho is one of the better strikers in the league. He did have a little bit of a drop off after he came on strong when he first came into MLS last season. But he's also seen a little bit of a price reduction, and now being only $8.7 million, he's a slightly cheaper option. It might be a good pick, especially being at home against a DC team. Number 4, we've got Carlos Vela. While Vela and LAFC didn't play in game week 1 because of their rescheduled match, I'm sure we're all aware of the potential that LAFC has, especially on the attacking front. That being said, Carlos Vela being one of the higher owned forwards in the game is still kind of interesting to me. I think his quality is still there, but I don't think that there's much of a debate that Carlos Vela is an obvious rotation risk. It doesn't seem like he's going to play many 90-minute games this year, and because of that, at $9 million, I think you can use your money better elsewhere on players that are going to play all game long. Number 3, we've got Dallas's Jesus Ferreira. They will be at home hosting LA Galaxy this week. They were at home hosting Minnesota last week, which I think a lot of people saw as a pretty good matchup for Ferreira and Dallas. But both Ferreira and Dallas were blanked, losing 1-0 to Minnesota at home. Number 2, we have a $4.0 million option in Justin Rennicks. Now, I didn't really want to put him in the top owned players list, but he did play and he is owned at almost 16% of managers, so I do have to put him in this list. That being said, when Justin Rennicks did get in the game for about his 15-20 minute cameo, he did look pretty good and he did end up accumulating an XG of 0.4. Again, I don't think Justin Rennicks is someone that is going to get a whole bunch of time, but at $4.0 million, you might as well stick him on your bench and see if you can get some price rise out of him. Returning to the position from last week, despite only having 2 points in game week 1, we've got Brandon Vasquez from FC Cincinnati. And he didn't have a very good game against Houston, only having an XG total of 0.1. And like I said before with the other Cincinnati players, I don't necessarily know that things get easier on the road at Orlando, but you gotta feel like if Cincinnati scores, Vasquez has a pretty good chance of scoring. And to give you some value forward options other than Justin Rennicks from New England, which I just talked about, first you've got Charlotte, $4.4 million option in Gaines. Now he is on the road to St. Louis this week, and I don't anticipate him to get too many points over the season. $4.4 million is a pretty good price point for a starting forward. Next, we got $5.1 million option from DC United, Christian Fletcher. Now, Fletcher isn't someone that started for DC United in game week 1, and in fact, he only ended up playing about 4 minutes, but in those 4 minutes, he was able to have the game-winning assist. Team which Wayne Rooney seems to be open to playing the youth. Maybe there's an opportunity for Fletcher to get some more time in the future. Next, we've got $5.5 million option from Montreal and Ibrahim. They are on the road at Austin this week. Now, Montreal is on the road to Austin, but we did see some shakiness out of Austin's defense last week. And with Cascante being out long-term, there's only more questions to be answered by Austin's defense. Next, you got $6.8 million Julian Schaffelberg from Nashville. He did pitch in with a goal against NYCFC. I do kind of question how his minutes are going to look once Hani Mukhtar comes back in the lineup. But if he does start at $6.8 million, he will be one of the better, cheaper options at the forward position. And lastly, at $7.0 million, I want to talk about LAFC's Opoku. He's someone that I think a lot of people rate really highly coming into 2023. The departure of Chicho Arango, there are a bunch of goals that have to be made up by someone in this LAFC roster. And whether that's Bouanga or Opoku, somebody's got to step up. And at $7 million, I'm willing to throw Opoku on my bench on the front end of a keeperoo. And maybe if it pans out and he ends up getting a goal and a decent return, I can take someone off my starting 11 that I'm not too entirely sure about. And to wrap up the video, we'll take a look at how I have my team lined up. I have to be honest, I've tinkered with this team quite a bit, but I think I finally worked out a squad that I feel comfortable with rolling into the weekend. And let's start with the goalkeepers. So it seems like LAFC has named John McCarthy their starter going into their first match in game week 2, where they'll host Portland at home. At $6 million, I really like the idea of putting McCarthy on my bench and seeing how it goes. And on the other end of that, I've got a decision that I'm not as comfortable with in Chicago's $4.5 million option in Richie. Now, because he is so cheap and because I've got McCarthy on the bench, I'm hoping it works out with McCarthy and that I don't actually end up having to go with Richie. But if I do end up having to go with Richie, that means McCarthy didn't do well, and maybe Richie can get a few bonus points to get me a 3, a 4, or 5, and all works out because I've only spent $4.5 million on him, and I've been able to use that money elsewhere, and hopefully I can make up some more points elsewhere on my starting 11. Moving on to the defenders, I'm going to stick with the same formation with game week 1 with 3 defenders at the back. And my first starting defender is going to be $6.5 million option from New England, Duan Jones. Now, New England did keep a clean sheet last week, and they will be against Houston at home this week, which I think Houston looks a little bit better than most had anticipated. But I still think New England has a pretty strong defense, a great goalie, and a pretty high clean sheet opportunity this week. And Duan Jones does have a little bit of attacking potential as well. My other starting defender that I have in there right now is Jackson Reagan from Seattle, who did see a price rise from $5.0 million to $5.5. Reagan was someone I had in my lineup initially last week, and I upgraded to Nuhu. They both ended up keeping a clean sheet, and I think they've got a pretty good shot to do so this week as well against RSL at home. And I've set up my last defender on my starting 11 as a $4.0 million scrub from Minnesota who's on a bye this week, where I'll let the Otteru decide between Diego Palacios, who has the first game of the week, and Kai Wagner from Philadelphia, who's playing against Inter Miami. In midfield, I'm bringing back the hero from game week 1, Daniel Gazdag. Now, I did talk about the rotation risk in Philadelphia this week, but I think Gazdag's pretty nailed on, and I think he's going to be in my team this week. Next, we got $8.5 million Christian Roldan from Seattle. I'm going to be open right away. I might move this to Nico Lodero. I think Roldan's going to be a game time decision, and what I mean by that is I think it's going to be between him and Nico Lodero, who is just a little bit cheaper than him. But I think either way, a Seattle team at home against RSL has some goals in them, and I think Lodero and Roldan will be involved. Next, we've got Austin Sebastian Driussi. Now, he did see a little bit of a price rise and is now listed at $9.3 million. But I think against an inexperienced Montreal team that doesn't really have it all together yet, I think there's goals to be had here. I don't think that offense is the issue for Austin. And even though he is one of the more expensive players, I'm happy to have Driussi in my team this week. cheaper option that I talked about in Jared Stroud. Like I said before, I really like the idea of St. Louis being at home in front of their home crowd in their new stadium for the first time. There is the chance that they get too hyped up and are a little hungover from their upset win at Austin in game week 1, but I think they'll be up for it. And I think Jared Stroud is a pretty good pick from St. Louis to have in your team. And at $5.0 million, he's the easiest player from St. Louis to fit in my team. And lastly, to wrap up my midfielders, at $9.2 million, I've got Columbus's Lucas Zelarayan. Lucas Zelarayan and Columbus didn't have a great game. We've already talked about the roadblock that Columbus ran into in game week 1, being on the road to Philadelphia, but I think Columbus is going to be a pretty good team, and at the forefront of that is going to be Lucas Zelarayan and Cucho Hernandez. And so this week, being at home against the DC team, I think Zelarayan's a really good pick. Starting with my forwards, someone I talked about from the value list, Opoko from LAFC. Now, they are in the first match of the game, so you will be able to see their points early if that's something you fancy. I do think I'm just going to end up throwing him in my starting 11 at $7.0 million. I really fancy that from an LAFC attack, and I'm willing to take a gamble on it. My last starting forward is $9 million Philadelphia Union Julian Carranza, who had a brace in game week 1 and will be playing against his former squad in Inter Miami in game week 2. Again, I feel like I'm beating the dead horse. There is an opportunity for some rotation in Philadelphia this week, but if Carranza's starting, I think he's someone that has an opportunity to get a goal or two. And just to wrap up my forwards, I do have Justin Rennicks from New England on my bench at $4 million. He's not someone I anticipate playing or getting points, but if he does end up coming onto the field and getting me some price rise, I'm okay with that. Right now, I have him in my team because he allows me to spend some money elsewhere, but I am hoping he does get on the pitch for a little cameo so we do see some price rise out of him. From a strategy perspective, there is a few things I could see myself doing here, especially if we do see some rotation from Philadelphia. And most importantly of that, I think what I would do is downgrade Kai Wagner to someone like Mbaizo, who's much cheaper and would allow me to upgrade someone in my midfield to someone like Thiago Almada, who I really rate their fixture being against Toronto at home. Going into game week 2, I have $1.16 million available, and with this lineup, I've used all but $0.1 million of that. If I were to come into some extra money somehow this weekend, one other thing I could see myself doing is upgrading my second goalkeeper to maybe someone like Daniel from San Jose, who's at home against Vancouver. All right, that's going to do it for the Game Week 2 preview and team reveal video. The Union are on the road this week, which means I should be watching games from home, and hopefully that means I'll be able to catch lineups a little better and be able to make changes in my lineup without accidentally forgetting to hit save or having any distractions get in the way or whatever excuse I can throw out there to make myself feel better. But regardless, I hope everyone feels good going into Game Week 2. Good luck with whatever team that you support. Good luck with whatever team you've built for this week, and look for a Game Week 2 reaction video coming Monday or Tuesday next week. If you're enjoying this type of content, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell below, as I do release multiple videos per week on MLS-related fantasy content. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. See you soon. Bye.